Did you know the Bible talks about constellations of stars in the sky? Did you know that this could prove Christianity is true? I had no idea this was a thing, so I had to get to the bottom of it. I contacted experts in the Bible and cosmology, of which now I'm an expert in both. Well, no, not really, but I do know enough to give you the answers you're looking for. Is there advanced scientific evidence of constellations of stars in the Bible? We'll find out today. I was notified of this supposed great advanced science after reading through a very sophisticated and scholarly debate in the Facebook comments section of one of my videos. Jimmy said, "The Bible is just like any storybook. You can take any of the characters in the story and put whatever spin you want on them and make up your own story." To which Blake responded, "Every scientific statement in the Bible is true, and science came to that same conclusion 1,000+ years later to be true." Jimmy responds, "Only in your mind, LOL. There is no proof, and the Bible is not a viable historical or scientific document or collection." Blake then smacks back, "No, the first statement is fact, independent of who wrote it or not. There are many scientific statements in the Bible of which none has been proven as being false." Of course, this intrigued me. In support of Blake's scientific proof of the Bible, he quotes from a 49-year-old book called Wonder Worlds, written by Philip L. Knox. It says, "In the 1920s, a prominent scientist named Charles Burkhalter was director of the Cabot Observatory in Oakland, California. One of his special interests was the giant red star Arcturus. It has 3 small stars in its wake and thus is referred to as Arcturus and his sons, or the bear and his cubs. This star is 400 times the diameter of our sun and is moving at super fast speed." Here's what Burkhalter wrote about this star. "This high velocity places Arcturus in that very small class of stars that apparently are a law unto themselves. He is an outsider, a visitor, a stranger within the gates. To speak plainly, Arcturus is a runaway." Newton gives the velocity of a star under control as not more than 25 miles a second, and Arcturus is going 257 miles a second. Therefore, combined attraction of all the stars we know cannot stop him or even turn him in his path. But is it out of control, or does God keep it from crashing into other stars and planets? Okay, so the claim is Arcturus is too big and too fast that it should be going out of control, but it isn't. Later he continues, "I showed Buchalter a statement in Job that amazed him, in which God asked Job about the stars. 'Can you guide the great bear with its cubs?' Job 38:32. This really intrigued him. How could someone living in 1500 BC know that Arcturus needed to be guided? So claim number 2 we have, God must be the one controlling it, so the constellation doesn't come apart. Claim number 3, Job 38:32 seems to be implying that God is the one who controls the constellations so it doesn't fall apart. Claim number 4, the writer of Job couldn't have known Arcturus needed to be guided or else it would fall apart. Additionally, on the topic, popular Christian apologist J. Warner Wallace said this, "Arcturus and his sons are on a course all their own. Only God has the power to guide them, just as described in the ancient book of Job." Okay, so I'm no astronomer, but I'm skeptical of the idea that a constellation like this would need God to be supernaturally guiding it in order for it not to come apart. It's not as if cosmologists are dumbfounded by how these stars are appearing to stay like they are. I asked cosmologist and young earth creationist Dr. Gideon Hartnett, who's written in over 200 peer-reviewed scientific journals, what he thought about this. It's important that he's a young earth creationist because that means that there's a good chance that he's probably not just trying to, prove evolution or, dispel the Bible. He's not some liberal Christian, okay? He said this, "If you believe the galaxy is gravitationally bound and is 10 billion years old, then you have to look for new physics, usually dark matter, to provide a mechanism for it to be bound traveling at a speed greater than escape velocity. But if you believe the galaxy was created only 6,000 years ago, then there's no problem at all, because even if those stars like that were escaping, there's been little time on the galactic scale for that to occur. So for creationists, there's no need to think that God is using some supernatural mechanism to keep the Arcturus in its pattern. Continuing, Knox describes his story about the scientist Burkhalter. He says, "Then he was shown another verse in which God asked Job, 'Can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades?' Job 38:31. Now this really got Burkhalter's attention. The star cluster of Pleiades amazes scientists, and Burkhalter was no exception. These 7 bright bluish stars are referred to as the Seven Sisters, and in Burkhalter's time, the cluster was known to actually consist of 250 stars, and now it has been determined that it numbers 800 or more. But incredibly, they are connected together in some mysterious way, all floating through space at the same speed and in the same direction, as if one scientist wrote, they are bound together in close kinship, or like a large flock of birds traveling to a distant location." Of course, this makes one ask, how did the writer of Job know this star cluster was bound together? So of course the claim is Pleiades is 800 stars or more, and they somehow go at the same speed in the same direction. Job 38:31 seems to imply that Pleiades is bound together. And the third claim being, the writer of Job couldn't have known Pleiades was bound without God's knowledge. Okay, so I did some digging and found out that this idea that Pleiades is a bound cluster of stars has actually been disproven. Dr. John Gideon Hartnett once again writes, "A bound cluster is in virial equilibrium and will not dissipate or break apart given sufficient time. An unbound cluster, on the other hand, is the opposite. The mutual gravitational forces between the constituents are insufficient over time to prevent the cluster's dissipation due to the relative motions of its members." Just to clarify, a bound cluster will stay together over a sufficient amount of time. On the other hand, an unbound cluster is the opposite. It will break up over a long period of time. He adds, Pleiades is a large but expanding or unbound cluster of stars that are all just passing the same region of space at the same time with the same motion. Of course, this makes things awkward if we are to read Job 38:31 as referring to advanced scientific knowledge about Pleiades being bound from an astronomical perspective. If the writer of Job was just referring to Pleiades as being bound, as in, the stars looking like they go together, then that seems quite obvious, even with the naked eye, and is therefore not advanced science. Knox then continues, Burkhalter was then shown the next line, in which God asks, "Can you loose the belt of Orion?" The constellation Orion, also known as the Hunter, has 3 very bright stars as its center, known as the Hunter's Belt. But unlike the Pleiades, the stars making up the belt, and even the entire constellation, are not bound together but coming apart. They are all traveling at different speeds and in completely different directions. In a short time, i.e. short in cosmological time, the belt will dissipate and indeed be loosed, and the entire constellation will disappear. After seeing these verses in Job, Burkhalter made a statement that attracted much attention. The study of the book of Job and its comparison with the latest scientific discoveries has brought me to the matured conviction that the Bible is an inspired book and was written by the one who made the stars. So summary, the constellation Orion is traveling at completely different speeds in different directions and is therefore coming apart. Another claim, the writer of Job seems to be implying that God is loosing or releasing the constellation of Orion. And the third claim, the writer of Job couldn't have known that the constellation of Orion was being not bound together without divine knowledge. J. Warner Wallace doesn't go as far to say this is advanced scientific knowledge. Instead, he makes a very different move. He says, "I doubt it was God's intentions to teach Job astronomy in this passage. Instead, God wanted to challenge Job and remind him who had the power, authority, and wisdom to control the fate of the universe. In a similar way, God wanted to remind Job who had the power to control Job's fate and the wisdom to care for him, even when Job felt unloved. While it wasn't God's purpose to reveal hidden scientific truths to Job in an effort to demonstrate his deity, the ancient text accurately describes the nature of these constellations and stars. Like other Old and New Testament passages, it is scientifically consistent, even if not scientifically exhaustive." So question, is this advanced science in Job, or is it just reliable if not advanced science. Young Earth creationist, cosmologist Dr. John Gideon Hartnett seems to have the answer for us again. He notes that we have actually discovered more about this cluster of stars, and therefore we have actually found out Orion is actually a very tightly bound cluster. He notes, Figure 7 shows an X-ray image of about 1,000 X-ray emitting stars in the Orion Nebula star cluster, taken by the Chandra X-ray Observatory. The X-rays are produced in the very high temperature atmosphere of these stars. These are the stars illuminating all the dust in the Orion Nebula. This image corresponds to a region of about 10 light years across. The bright stars in the center are part of the trapezium. This image clearly reveals a very tightly bound cluster, which obviously disagrees with the writer here trying to prove advanced science, as well as Dr. J. Warner Wallace, who's saying that it matches up with science. So, how are we as Christians to understand the writer of Job seeming to say that God was wrong about the formation of the constellations? Let's turn to how we should interpret these passages. First, we will look at the context surrounding the verses, then we need to know what the verses actually say in their ancient language. Then we will talk about what they mean. The verses that talk about constellations of stars is at the end of the book of Job. Job lost everything, already talked to his friends about why it all happened, and finally God comes onto the scene trying to show Job that God is in control and that he should just trust him. As we will see, God is rhetorically asking how little power Job has to get Job to understand how powerful God is. He says to Job in the NET translation, we use NET translation because it has pretty much the same standard language in most other translations. So, Job 38, 31 to 32. Can you tie the bands of the Pleiades or release the cords of Orion? Can you lead out the constellations in their seasons, or guide the bear with its cubs? Okay, so for about 99.99% of the entire Bible, we have pretty good idea what the words mean. On the other hand, what might be surprising to many English readers is that some translations are really just guesses. An obvious example is the word translated constellations here. If we leave it untranslated, verse 32 would be something like, can you leave out Mazarot in their seasons or guide the bear with its cubs? The smartest and best translators really don't have much of an idea on how to translate this. It's only mentioned one time in the Hebrew Bible. Scholars have identified it with the zodiacal circle, Arcturus, Sirius, Venus, and the Northern Crown. This is why it's translated in the NET as constellations, and other translations actually don't translate it at all because we just don't really know what it referred to. This comes down to how translations are made. In the best cases, a good translator will look at how a word is used in the Bible, looking at the root and etymology of the word, and comparing it with cognates, which is essentially the same word and is similar but not exactly the same cousin language, and then look at the history of translation throughout the ages. There's pretty wide agreement among scholars that the Hebrew word for Kasil and Kima are pretty accurately translated as Orion and Pleiades. In the case of Mazarot, we have very, very little evidence to make any conclusion. The Hebrew word that is translated as Arcturus or bear, which is Ash or Aish, is only in the Hebrew Bible twice. Outside of that, we have no other uses of the word. Job 9:9 gives us a little context by mentioning that the three constellations or stars are in the southern part of the sky, but even that's debated. For identifying little white dots in the sky, that's not much to go on. I asked my friend Dr. Ryan Armstrong, who wrote his dissertation on Job, what he thought, and he says this. There's a lot of debate about each of the names. The word Ish, that is often translated as bear, referring to the Arcturus constellation, is not the Hebrew word for bear or any language that I know of. It seems to be a proper noun for the constellation, but it doesn't occur anywhere in ancient Hebrew outside of Job 9:9 and Job 38:32. There's not much evidence that it's the bear or the lion, as it's often translated. Basically, translators try to guess at which one it's supposed to be. Okay, So why is it translated as Arcturus with its sons, or the bear with its cubs? In the popular American translations, the Hebrew words Aish al-Baneha obviously don't sound like either of those in English, so it's not as simple as matching up proper names. Considering we only have that one other time where it is mentioned in Job 9:9, one thing we can do is look at how it was translated throughout history. Past readers were closer to the original context of the original writers, so maybe they were in a better place to know the constellation it originally referred to. In this case, they don't provide much help because their translations and interpretations are literally all over the place. In Job 9:9, in the Septuagint that we have today, it has the text as Arcturon, which is one letter off from Arcturus, which could be a combination of the Greek words for bear and guardian. At the same time, the Septuagint has a different order from the Masoretic text, having Pleiades first instead of Arcturon, Hesperon next, which is the evening star, also known as Vesper, and then puts Arcturon third. On the other hand, the word Arcturon is completely absent in the verse in question, which is Job 38:32 in the Septuagint, and instead replaced by the Greek word Hesperon, as we have said, is for the evening star, also known as Vesper. In other words, it is difficult to tell what the translator was doing. The Vulgate has Arcturum in Job 9:9, but like the Septuagint, mentions the star Vesper in Job 38:32. Some scholars think Ibn Ezra read it as the Great Bear, but others don't think so. Another reason Job 38:32 has been translated as referring to the star Arcturus is because the Hebrew word Ash of Job 9:9 is similar to the Arabic word Na'ash, which was used to refer to the four stars of the Arcturus constellation at the time of Ibn Ezra. In addition, the Hebrew word Baneha of Job 38:32, often translated sons or cubs, is somewhat similar to the Arabic word Banat, which was used to refer to the three extra stars that weren't considered part of Na'ash in the constellation known as the Great Bear or Wain to these Arabs. The three extra stars, known as cubs, form the tail of the bear and the pole of the wain. That surely is an interesting coincidence, which is why so many modern translations go that option, as translating as the Great Bear. As we have mentioned, the word Ash of Job 9:9 is probably the same star or constellation referred to as Aish in Job 38:32, but this interpretation has issues. The obvious problem for linguists is how Na'ash came from Ash. The first letter pronounced as an English N would have to have been assimilated like the Hebrew word ish for man was assimilated to the root of the word for man in Arabic, which is int. The important difference being that it's much more improbable for the N sound to be added to the front compared to being assimilated in the middle of a word. Dr. Aaron Wilson Wright went through great detail to explain to me how the idea of Aish going to Na'ash in Arabic simply doesn't work. And let's just say that it gets into extremely nerdy language stuff, so be prepared.
Proto-Semitic, which is the hypothetical language from which all Semitic languages descend. You have three sibilants, or S sounds, as well as some other sort of sibilant-like sounds. So you have just plain S. You have this t sound, which in English you would see like at the end of words, right? Like cats, not really at the beginning of words. And then, this sound, or yeah, let me do the IPA instead, because that'll make it a little bit clearer. So it's what's known as a belted L. So it's like an L that has a little belt on it. And this is, so it's like the L sound, L, but it's voiceless. So it's fla, fla. So it's a very weird sound. So this is what you have in Proto-Semitic, these sounds. And then you also have, of course, the th sound as well. So we'll put that, which is theta in IPA. Yeah, just mentioning this, so this will hopefully become clear in a second. For basically, we have these sounds in Proto-Semitic, and they merge and change in the different Semitic languages in different ways. And so ultimately, I think what I'm going to show is that the Hebrew Aish and then Arabic Nash cannot come from the same root, basically. So in Hebrew, you have these Proto-Semitic sounds. You have S, and you have the th. And you have some Hebrew knowledge, right? Okay, yeah, I thought so. So these become the shin. So shin, words that have shin in them can either come from original S or original th. Proto-Semitic, this ts sound becomes the samek. This is how these all work out. In Hebrew, you have the S and the th become shin, the ts becomes the samek, and this fl sound becomes the sin. So sin probably would have been originally pronounced as fl. But then, okay, then in Arabic, and I'm going to write these in transliteration to avoid, I'm not going to use Arabic characters. So Arabic, you get things slightly differently. So you have the Proto-Semitic S and Proto-Semitic ts. This becomes the letter sin, or just becomes an S sound. The Proto-Semitic th sound just becomes th, like it stays the same. And this is the interesting one for us. This belted L becomes what in transcription, and I guess I'll write this in more Arabic E transcription, is the underlined T for the th, and it becomes the Arabic shin. And this is what becomes really confusing when you compare Arabic and Hebrew, and you need to sort of, it's important to keep this background in mind, because this, like, it's even in like some of the Hebrew dictionaries, like the Halot Hebrew dictionary, they'll propose cognates for, there'll be a Hebrew word that has a shin in it, and they'll say, well, okay, we think a related word in Arabic has this, the Arabic shin. Confusing, right? They have the same name, but they come from completely different sounds. So Hebrew shin is from Proto-Semitic S and th, and in Arabic, it's actually the descendant of this belted L, the fl sound. And so assuming that transcription, the na'ash, is correct, and this is representing this sh sound in Arabic, this would mean in Hebrew, right, with Aish, Ein, as I think I mentioned in our conversation about the alphabet, right, it can be either come from Rein, which is this R sound, or it can come from the normal Ein, which is what you learn when you learn Hebrew, right? That it just, I mean, I don't think when I learned Hebrew, we learned like what sound it really made, but it like makes this sound, right? Like it's kind of like choking sound. And then Aish means it probably just came from I. And then since it's a shin, right, we look at our correspondence here, it can be either S or th. So this could be S or th as the last. So we have, if we're looking for cognates in other languages, we unfortunately have a lot of different possibilities, right? We have 4 different possibilities, because you have 2 options for the first sound. It can be achain or ein, and 2 options for the third sound. It can be S or th. And then you have to like work out what those sounds become in the other languages. So looking, so this is, so Hebrew Aish, we'd say it could come from any of these 4 options. or ein, eith. And then, okay, so then we want to say, okay, what would this look like in Arabic? So we have our options for Proto-Semitic, and then we look at what these sounds become in Arabic. And we can see, so, if we looked at the Arabic equivalent of Aish, I mean, we could expect several different things, right? Depending on what the initial consonant is, but we would expect the final consonant to be either a s or a th, and not the sh. Or similarly, right, like if we go the other way and we say, okay, we have Arabic, I'll just try to represent like the transcription. So it's like na'ash, like that. Well, we see, okay, then this would be come from Proto-Semitic. N is always the same. A is always the same. Arabic ein is always from ein. But then this final consonant would be the belted L. And then if we took this Proto-Semitic na'af and like tried to run it back into Hebrew, we would expect something like na'as. One, you have the wrong sibilants, like we've been talking about, and then yeah, I mean, where would the N come from? Because there aren't a lot of N prefixes in Semitic languages. There are a couple words, although I'm struggling to think of some, but like, a prefix with an M is going to be much more common, right? Like Hebrew makom from kum, right? It's the place where you stand is a place. Or I think this is in biblical Hebrew and not modern, but like mifteach or mafteach, key. It's the thing you use to open something, so it's related to petach, to open. But yeah, N prefixes are much rarer in Semitic languages. So, and I think not super common in Arabic either, in particular. So, yeah, that would be kind of another hurdle, right? You need to explain where the N came from, as well as where, assuming the transcription is representing something like na'ash, like this, or I mean, it could also be there's no A here, but either way, there's no equivalent of the yod that you get in the Hebrew as well. So you need to account for the mismatch in the sibilants. Like, it's not what we would expect if these terms are cognate. Where the N comes from in Arabic / where the Y comes from or where the Y goes in the Hebrew.
Another option is shown in the Peshitta, which might be equivalent to the star Capella, but more plausibly is that it refers to the whole constellation Hyades, which the brightest star in Hades is Aldebaran. Additionally, Rabbi Yehuda also categorized it as Hades. Many scholars disagree with the Arcturus or Great Bear translation. As we will read, some say it's certain that Job is referring to Aldebaran, and the Baneha of Job 38:32 refers to the rest of the stars of the constellation Hades. I've been told that this is the consensus position in scholarship at the moment, and found it pretty difficult to find anyone that takes a different position. First, Gideon Hartnett notes, classical writers group Aldebaran with Pleiades, Hades, and Orion as heralds of the seasons. This makes sense that Pleiades, Orion, and Aldebaran would be associated together because they are literally right beside each other in the sky. On the other hand, Arcturus is practically on the other side of the sky, so it would be really weird if the writer of Job was thinking of Pleiades and Orion, which are right next to each other, and then include a random star in a place completely different in the sky. In argument for the Aldebaran translation, Dr. Choon-Leong Seow notes, another explanation links Hebrew Aish with rain, which means rain, a proper name for a star associated with rainfall and fertility. Accordingly, Aish would be an appropriate designation for Aldebaran, a star that, together with Hades, the cluster of stars around Aldebaran, is associated with rain and fertility. If Aldebaran is Aish in 38:32, Baneha must refer not to the cubs of the bear or the lioness, but to the small companions of Aldebaran. namely the cluster that is Hades. Now, Aish might look a lot different than
Raif.
but scholars don't see this as an issue at all because the first letter of Aish and
Raif.
is a guttural. In Hebrew, it makes the ch sound, but in Arabic, it's a little different. I don't know Arabic, so I'm not going to attempt to do that. In addition, the sh sound on Aish often turns into a th in other languages, which is what we see on the end of.
Raif.
This is similar to how in Yiddish they say Shabbos instead of Sabbath. Additionally, G.R. Driver notes, Shia Pirelli has surely proved up to the hilt that Aish or Ash is not the bear but Aldebaran, and that Benea are the Hades. Although the evidence of the ancient versions is conflicting, this only makes it clear that the translators had no clue to the identity of any of these constellations. These scholars are trying to change my Bible. I've never heard of the NRSV, NJBS, NAB, or TNIV. Why do these scholars think they're so much better than the translators of my Bible? I get it, baby Leviathan. It's a lot to take in. First of all, these scholars don't think that they are better than the translators of your Bible, but they have studied the topic a lot longer and know more about these really difficult and complicated topics compared to most translations, which don't have the money to hire experts on every single debate within Hebrew translating. Does that make sense? Yeah, we're good. We're good. Okay, thanks, guys. Really love you. Okay. Anyways, we've already showed that assuming that these three descriptions of constellation is talking about advanced science is a bad assumption. Two of them were scientifically wrong, and one simply doesn't have the right translation. If you don't think you can follow their linguistic arguments for the constellation Aldebaran, but also don't trust them for whatever reason, there's additional reasons to think this isn't about advanced science. The most obvious reason is because this supposed supernatural knowledge would have confused someone like Job, not to mention the audience that the book of Job was written for. It would be equivalent to if God were to ask Job,
Job, you know that concept of superposition in quantum mechanics? Can you keep a particle in multiple states simultaneously until a measurement is made? You can't, but I can't, so you must trust me.
why would Job say something that the ancients could not have known? The book was originally written by and for ancients using language and concepts they had to know to otherwise it would have been pointless for them. Many think this advanced knowledge is in there because God wants to prove himself true, that the Bible is inspired. In reality, it would be useless for Job's audience, confusing and unverifiable for 2,000 plus years. The book on Amazon that we've been reading from has 4 reviews. Basically, nobody knows about this. You're telling me that God made these verses essentially meaningless and risked confusion for 2,000 plus years simply so that a few people in the 21st century would have a little bit of extra evidence to think the Bible is inspired when we already have tons of evidence for its inspiration. On the other hand, if we don't assume these are talking about advanced science and ask ourselves how the ancients would understand these verses, maybe we can come to a more accurate understanding of how to read the Bible that doesn't have these major issues. The first thing to note is that this passage in Job is poetry. This means that most phrases in Job will be poetic or figurative more times than not. Now, not all phrases will be figurative, but most will. If we look at the context in the text, basically the entire passage is using figurative language. Immediately before it, the text says, "Does the rain have a father? Or who has fathered the drops of the dew? From whose womb does the ice emerge, and the frost from the sky, who gives birth to it? When the waters become hard like stone, when the surface of the deep is frozen solid." This mother and father language is obviously poetic. 2 big questions we need to ask are, what does the binding and loosing or tying and releasing mean? Depending on, what your translation, it could be either way. Let's read the passage about constellations again. It says, "Can you tie the bands of the Pleiades or release the cords of Orion?" Can you lead out the constellations in their seasons? Or guide Aldebaran? Job 38, 31 to 32. G.R. Driver notes, one possibility is that God is asking Job whether he can gather the stars and constellations or release them from their positions in such groups. But the question does not seem to be one referring to an act of creation, because that's what that would be, to the making and unmaking of the constellations. The context suggests rather the question whether Job, like God, can control their supposed seasonal influences. Can he prevent the Pleiades ushering in the spring, or release Orion from heralding the onset of winter? The Roman poets Terras Abruit, Soluta Plias gives a hint of a somewhat similar answer, that since floods were caused by the unleashing of the Pleiades, God asks Job whether he can prevent their unleashing and so check the rains. Alternatively, he asks him whether he can undo Orion's belt, and so deprive it of the power to exercise its proper function of bringing on the rains of autumn. For a warrior always had his girdle done up when he went out to battle. 2 Samuel 2:8 says, while having the girdle undone was to be incapable of action. Isaiah 27. In other words, God asks Job whether he can prevent the spring rains and the coming of summer, or bring about the failure of the autumnal rains and hold back the winter. This might sound a bit ridiculous to us modern readers, but to people in ancient times, the constellations had a very different meaning to them. This will make sense once we understand how we see constellations from a scientific perspective. What many might not realize is that we only see each of these arrangements of stars at a certain point of the year. Naturally, certain arrangements of stars would have been given additional meaning as times when the seasons would change or additional rainfall would occur. In this case, seeing Pleiades in the sky would mean spring must be coming. Additionally, seeing Orion would mean the onset of winter. These aren't super scientific claims, and we know this because the writers of Job didn't have any idea about these balls of gas and how they actually are. My friend Dr. Armstrong says it best. The biggest caveat that I always tell my students is to read poetry in a poetic way. Most of it is figurative language. The author isn't trying to write out a systematic theology about how God takes science from a womb, 38:29, takes ice from a womb. The author isn't trying to write out a systematic theology of how God takes ice from a womb and binds Pleiades in chains. It's a flowery way of saying that God oversees all the aspects of nature. This answers the question as to if Job 38 is scientifically reliable as proposed by cold case detective J. Warner Wallace. The answer is no, because it's not a science textbook and isn't making scientific claims. Reminder, if you want to show that there is advanced scientific knowledge in the Bible, you have to say that it's not just possible that there is advanced scientific knowledge, but that it's the most probable. Pointing to one text and finding something else in the 21st century that merely looks like it isn't enough. The Bible is an ancient but inspired text from God and deserves more care than that. That's it for this video. We talked about claims of advanced science in Job, constellations, and how to read the Bible better. If you found this valuable, feel free to subscribe to the channel so you'll make sure to see the rest of our content. I also interviewed Bible scholar Stephen Myers on other claims of advanced science in the Bible, and you can check that out here. Jesus, can you do the thing? Oh yeah, sure. What? No.